a city gripped by fear. It was the mid-1930s, deep in the shadows of America's Great Depression. Cleveland, Ohio, once a city of steel, industry, and promise, had fallen into a darker rhythm. Streets cracked under economic collapse, and entire neighborhoods seemed swallowed by despair. But no one in Cleveland could have imagined the horror that would descend upon them in the form of a phantom who would be remembered only by the name: the Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The first discovery came quietly, almost like an omen whispered to the city. Along the desolate railroad tracks that cut through the poor district known as Kingsbury Run, police stumbled upon remains so altered that even the hardened investigators hesitated to step closer. The scene did not resemble the aftermath of any ordinary crime. It carried the markings of someone meticulous, someone deliberate, the work of a hand that understood anatomy all too well. Whispers spread before the newspapers even hit the stands. People in taverns, boarding houses, and factory floors leaned close to one another, trading rumors about what had been found. "A monster walks among us," some said. Others insisted it was the work of a madman with a surgeon's touch. The fear was immediate and contagious because in the heart of Cleveland, no one knew who might be next. Kingsbury Run was a place already steeped in shadows. A stretch of rail lines and shanty towns where the homeless, the jobless, and the forgotten lived in rickety shelters of wood and tin. It was here, among society's most vulnerable, that the phantom seemed to hunt. People who disappeared from those streets often left no trace, no family to report them missing. And when they were found, it was never whole. It was as if the killer was sending a message. No one is safe, not even the invisible. The newspapers wasted no time in giving the phantom a name. The Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run splashed across the front pages, letters bold and terrifying. Editors understood what sold papers: the mixture of fascination and dread. Each headline magnified the terror. Each story dragged readers deeper into the abyss of speculation. Was it a doctor gone astray? A slaughterhouse worker with a taste for cruelty? Or was something far worse, something inhuman? The police struggled in the beginning. Evidence was scarce, and what little they had seemed almost like a cruel joke. Whoever this phantom was, he or she knew how to cover tracks. But the most chilling element wasn't the lack of clues, it was the precision. This wasn't chaos. This was order, a pattern, a ritual. And in that realization, the people of Cleveland understood that they weren't dealing with random violence. They were dealing with something calculated. Someone who selected, prepared, and executed a plan with a confidence that mocked the law itself. By the winter of 1935, parents warned their children not to wander alone. Workers hurried home before nightfall, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. Kingsbury Run became a place spoken of in whispers, as if saying its name too loudly might summon the phantom from the shadows. People locked their doors, though deep down they wondered if locks could stop such a figure at all. The city had faced hardship before: bank runs, unemployment, gangsters. But this was different. Gangsters shot and ran. This phantom lingered, played with the city like a puppeteer pulling strings of fear. There was no pattern to the timing, no clear motive, only a dreadful rhythm that left the police groping in the dark. Thus begins the tale of the Cleveland torso murders the reign of terror that turned a struggling city into a haunted one. In this story, we will walk the fog-filled railways of Kingsbury Run, descend into the world of the forgotten, and trace the steps of a phantom who has never been unmasked. And as we move forward, remember this: fear in Cleveland did not come all at once. It came slowly, body by body, headline by headline. The phantom revealed himself not in who he was, but in what he did. And the legacy of that terror has never faded. The first victims, the fear that gripped Cleveland, did not remain abstract for long. It was given shape, form, and terror in the identities, or rather the anonymity of the first victims. Their discovery marked the moment when rumor transformed into undeniable reality. In September 1934, the first grim discovery was made near Jackass Hill, a notorious hangout for transients. A young man, wandering through the brush, stumbled upon what at first appeared to be discarded clothing. But when he looked closer, he realized the truth: a body mutilated and stripped of all means of identification. The head was missing, as if removed deliberately. The victim, later dubbed the Lady of the Lake, became the unofficial beginning of the nightmare, though some investigators would argue her case was not formally linked until later. Nevertheless, she was a symbol of what was to come, a victim erased of identity, robbed of voice, and left as a warning. Only a year later, in September 1935, Cleveland was confronted with a second horror. Boys playing near the East 49th Street Bridge stumbled upon remains that were unmistakably human. This time, investigators noticed something chillingly precise. The cuts suggested knowledge, skill, perhaps even medical training. The second victim, a man in his mid-30s, was as nameless as the first. He, too, had been left in a state that defied recognition. 2 weeks later, another body appeared. Again, the same dreadful signature: decapitation, careful dismemberment, and an eerie absence of personal artifacts. It was as though the phantom had stripped these people not only of life, but of their humanity, reducing them to puzzles scattered across the city's forgotten corners. The police now knew they were not facing coincidence. This was a pattern. The press, eager to feed the city's growing panic, emphasized the phantom's deliberate cruelty. Each article painted Cleveland as a city under siege, each headline more sensational than the last. The words serial and butcher began to intertwine in the public's imagination, and the name the Butcher of Kingsbury Run spread like wildfire. Yet the most terrifying aspect was not the brutality itself, it was the anonymity of the victims. Many were drifters, men and women living on the margins, without families to identify them or power to demand justice. They disappeared without consequence, and when they were found, the city had no names to mourn, no identities to honor. They were shadows before they died, and shadows they remained. Thus, by the end of 1935, Cleveland was no longer whispering rumors of a phantom. It was staring directly into the face of a nightmare that would only grow darker with each passing year. The first victims were gone, but their silence screamed across Kingsbury Run, echoing a single truth: the butcher had only just begun. The discovery of Kingsbury Run. Kingsbury Run, the grim stage upon which this phantom played, was not just a place, it was an entire world hidden within Cleveland. Stretching along the railroad tracks that carved through the city's industrial underbelly, it was a wasteland of ash, soot, and despair. Here, the poorest of the poor migrants, drifters, and the unemployed built shantytowns of tin and scrap wood, desperate for shelter in the midst of the Great Depression. For city officials and wealthier residents, Kingsbury Run was an eyesore. For the phantom, it was a hunting ground. The geography of the run played directly into the killer's hands. Dense underbrush, isolated ravines, and abandoned railcars created perfect hiding places for unspeakable deeds. By day, the shanties buzzed with the muted chatter of survival. By night, shadows consumed the campfires, and whispers turned into silence, as if even the desperate souls who lived there knew they were being watched. When the first bodies were discovered within Kingsbury Run, the area's reputation plummeted even further. It was no longer just a district of poverty, it was cursed land, a place where the city's lost went not only to fade away, but to vanish entirely. The press capitalized on this imagery, describing the run as a labyrinth of filth and fear, a stage set perfectly for a predator. The people of Cleveland, already uneasy, now believed the city had a heart of darkness that could not be controlled. Law enforcement faced immense challenges. Witnesses were scarce, and those who might have seen something were often transients themselves, wary of the police. Every corner of Kingsbury Run seemed to offer both opportunity and concealment. Investigators found themselves walking through mud and trash, searching for clues among a population that lived in fear not only of the phantom, but also of eviction, hunger, and neglect. The Phantom's choice of Kingsbury Run was deliberate and chillingly effective. It was a place where people vanished without questions, where screams were swallowed by the rumble of passing trains, and where the city's elite preferred not to look. It was, in essence, the perfect killing ground. As 1936 approached, the run would not only become the center of the investigation, it would become synonymous with the terror itself. The name Kingsbury Run no longer described just a location on a map. It described fear incarnate, a place where the invisible met their end, and where a phantom carved his legacy into Cleveland's history. Patterns of the killer. As the discoveries mounted, investigators began to notice a grim consistency. The Phantom was not acting impulsively, nor did he leave his victims in random states of disarray. Instead, each case carried the hallmarks of ritual, a deliberate method that suggested calculation rather than chaos. The most striking feature was always the same: decapitation. The victims were stripped not only of their lives, but of their identities. Without heads, identification became nearly impossible, and in many cases the police could not even determine who these people had been in life. It was a sinister way of erasing them twice, first as individuals, then as names in the record. Equally chilling was the precision of the cuts. Medical examiners remarked that the work suggested some knowledge of anatomy, perhaps even surgical experience. This was no clumsy hand. Whoever wielded the blade knew exactly where to cut, how to dismember swiftly, and how to make the work seem disturbingly efficient. To the investigators, it was as if the Phantom was mocking them, flaunting his skills while leaving just enough horror behind to freeze the blood of the entire city. Another pattern soon emerged: the choice of victims. Many were drifters, the homeless, or those living in the fringes of Kingsbury Run. They were people with few connections, few advocates, and little chance of being immediately missed. To the Phantom, they were ideal prey, vulnerable, nameless, and easily disposed of. The killer had selected not just a place, but a type of person society itself had abandoned. In several cases, torsos and limbs were discovered separately, scattered across the run or in nearby ravines. It was as though the Phantom was playing a grotesque game with the police, daring them to piece together the human puzzle he left behind. The separation of remains added another layer of horror. It suggested planning, transportation, and a cold detachment from the act itself. The police began cataloging these consistencies, desperate to build a profile. But for every pattern they identified, more questions arose. Was the Phantom a doctor, as many believed? Was he a butcher or slaughterhouse worker, using the tools and knowledge of his trade for unspeakable purposes? Or was he something else entirely, a predator who simply learned through practice, refining his ritual over time? By 1936, it was clear Cleveland was in the grip of not just a killer, but an artist of horror. Each victim was a signature, each discovery a message. The Phantom's pattern was not only a method, it was a language, one written in silence, fear, and the absence of identity. And as the city recoiled in terror, one thing became certain. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run was far from finished. The media frenzy. By the time multiple bodies had been discovered, the press had already transformed the nightmare into daily headlines. Cleveland's newspapers, locked in fierce competition for readers, knew that fear sold papers as effectively as any sports score or political scandal. The story of the Phantom dominated front pages, and with each new discovery, the language became more lurid, the headlines more shocking. It was the press that cemented the killer's infamous name, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The phrase conjured both madness and precision, horror and calculation. It was a name designed to freeze blood and capture imagination, and it worked. Within weeks, the title was repeated from Cleveland's poorest neighborhoods to its wealthiest suburbs. No one could escape the shadow of the Butcher. Articles speculated endlessly about the Phantom's identity. Some reporters insisted he was a doctor, pointing to the surgical nature of the dismemberment. Others claimed he was a slaughterhouse worker, a man hardened by years of cutting flesh. Still others spun theories of a drifter driven mad by poverty, stalking those as broken as himself. Every possibility was printed, and each one made the killer seem even more elusive. Illustrations and photographs accompanied the stories, showing police searching the run, detectives grim-faced over evidence, and ominous drawings of the Phantom that blurred the line between journalism and fiction. The public devoured these images, cutting out clippings to pin on walls, trading them in bars, whispering over them in cafes. The Butcher had become larger than life, his shadow stretching far beyond Kingsbury Run itself. This sensational coverage brought both help and harm to the investigation. On one hand, the relentless publicity forced city officials to act, pouring resources and manpower into the hunt. On the other hand, the frenzy created confusion. Tips flooded in from across Ohio and beyond, many of them false leads born from hysteria. Every shadow became suspicious, every stranger a potential phantom. The fear stoked by the newspapers seeped into everyday life. Factory workers walked home in groups. Children were forbidden to play near the tracks, and even the police confessed unease when patrolling Kingsbury Run after dark. Cleveland had become a city of whispers, each headline another echo of dread. By 1936, the Butcher was no longer just a murderer, was a cultural force. The media had etched him into the collective psyche, ensuring that every Cleveland citizen lived in the grip of his legend. And in doing so, they transformed the Phantom from a hidden predator into a household name, a figure whose notoriety only grew as his crimes continued. Detective Eliot Ness enters. By 1936, Cleveland's terror had reached a fever pitch. The string of murders had stretched into the double digits, and the Phantom's confidence seemed unshakable. Each discovery was more brazen than the last, and the city's leadership realized that conventional policing was failing. The public demanded action, and in their desperation, city officials turned to one of the most famous lawmen in America, Eliot Ness. Ness was no ordinary detective. Known nationwide as the leader of the legendary Untouchables, he had built his reputation during Prohibition by taking down Al Capone in Chicago. By the mid-1930s, he was safety director of Cleveland, responsible for overseeing not only the police, but also fire services and public safety as a whole. To the citizens of Cleveland, he was a symbol of incorruptibility and resolve, a man who had faced down gangsters and lived to tell the tale. His entrance into the investigation brought both hope and spectacle. The press seized on his involvement, printing stories that suggested Ness would do what no one else could: bring the Phantom of Kingsbury Run to justice. For the first time, the city allowed itself to believe the nightmare might end. Ness approached the case with characteristic intensity. He demanded reports, reorganized the investigative teams, and personally inspected the sites where remains had been found. His presence alone seemed to galvanize the police, who had been worn down by years of fruitless searches. Under his command, patrols were increased, detectives reassigned, and new strategies developed. Yet even as Ness threw himself into the case, the Phantom continued to strike. Bodies appeared as though to mock the celebrated detective, as if the killer relished the challenge of outwitting a national hero. Each new discovery seemed timed to coincide with moments of greatest public pressure, a cruel reminder that the Phantom dictated the tempo, not the police. Still, Ness' reputation gave Cleveland something it desperately needed: a figure of defiance against the terror. People clung to the hope that if anyone could bring order to the chaos, it was Eliot Ness. The very fact that the Butcher had drawn such a man into the fight elevated the case from local horror to national spectacle. The eyes of America turned to Cleveland, waiting to see if the untouchable could face down a phantom with no face. But as the months wore on, the grim truth began to surface. Even Eliot Ness, the man who had toppled Capone, was walking blind in Kingsbury Run. The phantom left no trail, only fragments of victims and whispers in the dark. For the first time, the famed lawman found himself not battling men with guns, but a shadow who thrived in silence. And it was a battle he could not win easily. Mounting panic in Cleveland. By the late summer of 1936, Cleveland was no longer just unsettled, it was consumed by panic. Each fresh discovery seemed to confirm that the phantom had no intention of stopping, and that the city was powerless to prevent the horror. The sense of dread seeped into daily life like a poison cloud, touching every corner of the community. Factory workers began refusing to walk home alone, preferring to cluster in groups despite the inconvenience. Parents forbade their children from venturing anywhere near Kingsbury Run, turning what had once been a playground of abandoned lots into a forbidden zone. Even the most hardened police officers admitted in private that patrolling the area after dark made their skin crawl. The shantytowns of Kingsbury Run were hit hardest. Already plagued by poverty and neglect, the residents now found themselves under siege from both fear and suspicion. Every drifter was eyed with distrust, every newcomer treated as a possible predator. The community, fractured and desperate, began to turn on itself. Fights broke out in taverns and shelters as nerves frayed, and whispers of "who's next" became as common as greetings. Meanwhile, the city's leadership scrambled to maintain control. Public statements urged calm, but their hollow reassurances rang false against the steady drumbeat of new headlines. Newspapers printed grisly sketches and bold captions, amplifying the terror with each edition. Radio broadcasts debated the phantom's identity, fueling rumors that spread faster than the facts. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run had become not just a killer, but a living legend of dread. As fear grew, so did public pressure on law enforcement. Citizens demanded answers, and yet the investigation seemed mired in dead ends. No matter how many detectives were reassigned, no matter how many nights were spent combing the run, the phantom stayed one step ahead. It was as though he could sense the police closing in and always slipped away before the net could tighten. The tension reached a breaking point in September 1936, when another pair of remains was discovered within weeks of one another. The precision was unmistakable, the phantom's signature undeniable. Cleveland reeled once more, realizing that this was not a spree, not a momentary madness. This was a campaign of terror, calculated and deliberate, stretching on with no end in sight. By now, the phantom had achieved something few killers ever manage. He had paralyzed an entire city. Shadows became enemies. Silence became threats, and every corner of Cleveland seemed infected by paranoia. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run was no longer just a figure in the dark, was everywhere, haunting minds and twisting the city's very heartbeat into a rhythm of fear. Suspects and shadows. As the death toll mounted, detectives knew they had to find a face to pin to the phantom. But in a city already teeming with drifters, immigrants, and the desperate, suspicion cast a wide net. Every man in Kingsbury Run seemed a potential suspect, every shadow a possible threat. The police files grew thick with names, but evidence remained frustratingly thin. The first serious suspects were men already known to law enforcement. Ex-convicts, drifters with violent pasts, and those with medical training all came under scrutiny. Detectives interviewed butchers, hospital workers, and slaughterhouse employees, searching for anyone whose background hinted at the anatomical skill suggested by the phantom's grisly signatures. But time and again, leads fizzled out, leaving only more questions. Some investigators became convinced that the phantom was not an outsider at all, but someone hiding in plain sight within Cleveland's working class. The meticulous cuts pointed towards someone who had practiced his craft over years, possibly a surgeon fallen from grace, or a meat worker hardened by routine. But while theories abounded, none could be proven. Meanwhile, the public's imagination spun suspects of its own. Every stranger became dangerous. Every man who walked the streets after dark, a potential phantom. Whispers of secret societies, occult practices, and traveling killers began to circulate, fueled by sensational press coverage. In taverns and barber shops, people swore they knew who was responsible, pointing to neighbors and co-workers in fits of paranoia. Perhaps the most damaging aspect of this suspicion was its sheer breadth. The investigation lacked focus, sprawling across too many possibilities. Detectives chased rumors as often as facts, and with each dead end, public trust eroded further. Eliot Ness and his men, once heralded as saviors, began to feel the sting of failure as more victims turned up. In truth, the Butcher of Kingsbury Run was like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to pin down. For every suspect brought in, another was released. For every lead pursued, another vanished into thin air. The phantom thrived in the city's confusion, using its shadows as a shield. By 1937, one thing had become clear: suspicion alone would never be enough to catch the phantom. Cleveland was drowning in shadows, and the true face of the butcher remained as elusive as ever. The gruesome evidence. With each new discovery, the evidence left behind by the phantom grew more unsettling. Though the killer seemed to take great care in covering his tracks, what remained painted a picture of both cruelty and precision. Every body told a story not of the victim's life, but of the phantom's method. The medical examiners who studied the remains noted the same disturbing traits again and again: clean, deliberate separations, as though the work had been carried out by someone with knowledge of anatomy. These were not frenzied attacks born of passion, they were calculated acts, executed with almost mechanical precision. The phantom seemed less like a frenzied predator and more like a craftsman, shaping his work according to a dark design. Investigators also noticed that many of the victims had been drained of blood before being discarded. This detail suggested a chilling level of control, as though the phantom operated in a space where he had time and privacy. The idea that the killer had a workshop or secret place of operation added another layer of terror to the case. The thought that somewhere in Cleveland, behind a locked door or beneath a basement floor, the phantom had created his lair. Another consistent feature was the absence of personal belongings. Wallets, clothing, jewelry, anything that might offer a clue to identity was stripped away. The victims were erased, reduced to nameless figures whose only legacy was the horror of their discovery. It was as though the phantom took pride not just in ending their lives, but in erasing who they had been. One particularly disturbing case in 1936 involved a pair of victims found within weeks of each other. The remains were so alike in their condition that investigators believed they had been prepared in exactly the same way, almost as if the phantom followed a ritual. The thought that the killings might have been ceremonial or driven by some private obsession spread unease even among hardened detectives. Forensic science in the 1930s was limited, and Cleveland's investigators lacked the advanced tools available today. Still, they tried to piece together what they could: the approximate ages, the rough timelines of death, and the consistency of the wounds. The result was always the same pattern that pointed not to chaos, but to design. And yet, for all this evidence, the phantom himself remained invisible. The precision, the erasure of identity, the careful staging these details spoke volumes about the method, but revealed nothing of the man. The phantom left behind bodies, but no fingerprints. Horror, but no face. And so the investigation dragged on, a grim puzzle with too many missing pieces. The Kingsbury Raid. By 1938, Cleveland's terror had stretched on for years, and Eliot Ness knew something drastic had to be done. The Phantom had mocked the police at every turn, leaving bodies scattered across Kingsbury Run as though daring them to act. Ness, pressured by both the public and the press, realized that conventional investigation had reached its limits. It was time to strike at the very heart of the Phantom's hunting ground. In a move that shocked the city, Ness ordered a full-scale raid on the shanty towns of Kingsbury Run. In the dead of night, his men swept through the ramshackle shelters, dragging out hundreds of vagrants, drifters, and the destitute. The police searched every hut, every lean-to, looking for evidence, suspects, anything that might lead to the Butcher. And then, in a decision that would haunt Ness' reputation forever, they set the shanty town ablaze. The flames consumed the shelters as their inhabitants watched in shock. The reasoning, Ness explained later, was simple. By destroying the Phantom's hunting ground, they would cut off his access to victims. But to the residents, many of whom had nowhere else to go, it was a cruel act of desperation, punishing the poor rather than catching the predator who stalked them. The raid sent a powerful message. It showed that Ness was willing to take bold, even ruthless action in the fight against the Phantom. But it also revealed the limits of his strategy. The raid yielded no suspects, no evidence, no Phantom. The fires burned away the shanties, but they did not burn away the terror. If anything, the Phantom seemed to retreat into the city's shadows, waiting for the flames to die down before emerging once more. The press had a field day. Some hailed Ness as a man of action, praising his decisiveness in a time of fear. Others condemned him, calling the raid a shameful act of cruelty against the helpless. The duality of public opinion mirrored the uncertainty of the investigation itself. Was Ness a savior, or had he simply destroyed lives without solving the case? For Cleveland's citizens, the raid was a turning point. The sight of the burning shantytown was unforgettable, a vision of both order and chaos, authority and despair. And while Ness had hoped to cut off the Phantom's access to victims, the truth soon became clear. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run did not rely on a single hunting ground. His reach extended beyond the ashes of Kingsbury Run, and his reign of terror was far from over. Theories about the killer, with years of fear behind them and no clear suspect brought to justice, Cleveland's citizens and investigators turned increasingly to theories. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run had become a figure of speculation as much as terror, and everyone from detectives to journalists to ordinary citizens had a theory about who the Phantom might be. One of the most persistent theories was that the killer was a doctor. The precision of the dissections, the surgical neatness of the cuts, and the apparent anatomical knowledge suggested someone with formal medical training. Some pointed to disgraced surgeons, men who had lost their licenses or reputations, wandering into obscurity and madness. If one of them had chosen Kingsbury Run as his playground, it would explain much about the method. Another theory focused on butchers and slaughterhouse workers. Cleveland was an industrial city, and meatpacking was one of its major trades. Workers in those industries were familiar with knives, with cutting efficiently and without hesitation. Perhaps the Phantom was not a doctor, but a man from the killing floors of the stockyards, practicing his craft on a darker canvas. Some detectives suggested the killer was a drifter himself, someone living among the homeless of Kingsbury Run. This would explain his ability to move through the area unnoticed and why he selected victims from that population. Blending in, he could stalk without suspicion, a wolf hidden among the sheep. The problem with this theory was the sheer skill involved in it seemed at odds with the life of a transient. Others whispered about a more sinister possibility, that the Phantom was protected by power. Some believed he was connected to organized crime, shielded by a network that ensured he would never be caught. Still others suggested a political cover-up, that the authorities knew who he was but dared not expose him. Theories of conspiracy gained traction as the years passed without resolution. For the press, these theories were fuel for headlines. Articles speculated wildly, weaving tales of mad doctors, deranged butchers, and secret societies. Each possibility seemed both plausible and terrifying, and the lack of answers only deepened the mystery. The Phantom's power grew precisely because no one could agree on his identity. By the end of the decade, the theories had outgrown the evidence. The Phantom was no longer just a manha, was a myth, a story told in taverns and whispered in alleys. And perhaps that was his greatest weapon. In a city grasping for certainty, the Butcher of Kingsbury Run remained forever uncertain, a shadow that defied every theory and haunted every imagination. The prime suspect, Dr. Francis Sweeney. As theories swirled, one name began to rise above the rest: Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. For many investigators, he became the embodiment of everything they believed about the Butcher of Kingsbury Run. He was a man of medicine, a veteran, and someone whose troubled mind and violent tendencies made him a prime suspect. Dr. Sweeney had served in World War I, working in field hospitals where amputations and battlefield surgery were a grim necessity. Those who knew him said he returned from the war a changed man, haunted, volatile, and often drunk. By the 1930s, his medical practice had collapsed, and he drifted into obscurity, living on the margins of society. Yet his skills with a scalpel remained undeniable, and investigators couldn't ignore how closely his background matched the Phantom's profile. Eliot Ness himself focused on Sweeney. Under intense pressure to deliver results, Ness arranged for the doctor to undergo a series of interrogations and even a polygraph test, one of the earliest ever used in Cleveland. The results, though never fully disclosed, were said to be damning. According to some accounts, Sweeney failed the test spectacularly, sweating and trembling under the weight of unspoken secrets. Despite this, Ness never arrested him. There was no physical evidence tying Sweeney to the murders, no witness who could place him at the scenes. All Ness had was suspicion, a broken man's history, and the results of a still experimental lie detector. To bring Sweeney to trial would have been a gamble the case could not withstand. In the years that followed, Sweeney descended further into instability. He committed himself to mental institutions more than once, often disappearing for months at a time. From behind asylum walls, he reportedly sent taunting postcards to Eliot Ness, mocking the detective's inability to catch him. The handwriting on those cards was never definitively proven to be Sweeney's, but the psychological torment they inflicted was undeniable. For Ness, Sweeney became the Phantom in the flesh, the suspect he could never prove guilty, but never quite eliminate either. Even after his retirement, Ness would reportedly confide to friends that he believed Sweeney was the Butcher. And yet, history would remember the doctor not as a convicted criminal, but as a shadowy figure on the edge of certainty, forever branded by suspicion but never by law. In the story of the Cleveland torso murders, Dr. Francis Sweeney stands as the closest the city ever came to unmasking its Phantom. Whether he truly was the Butcher or merely a troubled man who fit the narrative too well remains one of the most enduring mysteries of the case. Decline of the murders. By 1938, the Phantom's reign of terror began to fade, though no one could say why. The discoveries that had once come with alarming regularity slowed, and then, almost without warning, stopped altogether. For a city gripped by years of fear, the silence was both a relief and a mystery. Some believed the Phantom had been scared off by the relentless attention of Eliot Ness and his men. The raids, the patrols, and the national headlines had made it impossible for the Butcher to operate in the shadows as he once had. Perhaps, they reasoned, he had fled Cleveland, slipping away to another city, another hunting ground where no one knew his name. Others suggested that the Phantom had been caught not for the torso murders, but for some other crime. jailed under a different charge. He might have disappeared quietly into the prison system, his true identity never exposed. Still others whispered that the Phantom had taken his own life, a final act of silence after years of tormenting the city. Of course, the most tantalizing theory was that Dr. Francis Sweeney had been the killer all along, and that his repeated confinements to mental institutions had effectively ended the murders. The timing aligned too closely for many to dismiss. As Sweeney slipped deeper into madness, the killings in Cleveland all but ceased. Though never proven, the connection became a cornerstone of the case's folklore. For Cleveland's citizens, the decline of the murders brought no closure. Instead, it left an aching void, a silence heavy with questions. Why had the Phantom stopped? Was he truly gone, or merely waiting? The absence of answers became its own kind of terror, a reminder that the Butcher had always thrived on uncertainty. By the end of the decade, Cleveland tried to move forward. The shanty towns of Kingsbury Run were gone. The headlines had faded, and new challenges demanded attention. But beneath the surface, the fear lingered. The Phantom had disappeared, but his shadow remained, a permanent scar on the city's memory. Legacy of fear. Even after the killings ceased, the shadow of the Butcher lingered over Cleveland. The city, already scarred by the Great Depression, carried the weight of the murders as a wound that refused to heal. For years, people spoke of Kingsbury Run not just as a place, but as a Warninga reminder that within the cracks of society, something unspeakable had thrived. The residents who had lived through the terror remembered the years of fear vividly. Parents recalled pulling their children indoors before nightfall. Workers remembered clutching their coats tighter as they hurried past dark alleys. And police officers admitted that patrolling Kingsbury Run left them uneasy long after the Phantom had disappeared. The fear had seeped too deep to vanish overnight. Cleveland's reputation, too, bore the stain. For decades, the city was synonymous with the Butcher, the case mentioned in the same breath as other infamous unsolved crimes. Tourists came not only for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame or Lake Erie's shores, but also to seek out the dark lore of Kingsbury Run, where whispers of the Phantom remained alive. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists found endless inspiration in the case. The murders became the subject of novels, documentaries, and even fictionalized retellings. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run was more than a killer. He had become folklore, a boogeyman who transcended fact to embody fear itself. Every generation rediscovered his story, reshaping it into new forms of cautionary tales and haunting entertainment. Perhaps most importantly, the case reshaped the way law enforcement approached investigations of serial crimes. The failures of the Cleveland police, the mishandled evidence, the lack of coordination, the inability to secure convictions became lessons studied by future generations. In this sense, the Butcher's legacy was not only one of fear, but also of reform, a grim teacher whose crimes forced policing to evolve. Yet for all the stories told and the lessons learned, the essence of the case remained unsatisfying. There was no resolution, no justice. Families of victims never received closure, and the city never saw the Phantom unmasked. Fear lingered precisely because it was unfinished, and because the Butcher had taught Cleveland that sometimes monsters walk unseen, and sometimes they vanish without ever being caught. Unanswered questions. As the years turned into decades, the Cleveland torso murders settled into history as one of America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Though the killings stopped, the questions never did. The Phantom had vanished, but the void he left behind was filled with speculation, frustration, and unease. Why did the murders end so abruptly? Did the Phantom die, flee, or simply choose to stop? Was Dr. Francis Sweeney truly the Butcher, locked away in mental institutions and taunting Eliot Ness from behind barred windows? Or had the city been hunting the wrong man all along, while the true killer slipped quietly into obscurity? The lack of physical evidence left investigators grasping at shadows. Forensic science was too primitive in the 1930s to provide the certainty that modern methods might have offered. No fingerprints, no DNA, no definitive witness ever surfaced to anchor the investigation. All that remained were fragments of bodies and fragments of theories, none strong enough to reveal the whole truth. The unanswered questions extended beyond the identity of the killer. Why did the phantom target the poor, the transient, the forgotten? Was it convenience or a twisted ideology? What satisfaction did he draw from erasing their identities, leaving them nameless even in death? The absence of motive was as disturbing as the absence of justice. For Eliot Ness, the case remained a personal failure. Though he had brought down gangsters and bootleggers, he never unmasked the phantom of Kingsbury Run. In later years, he would rarely speak of the case, but those who knew him believed it haunted him until his final days. The postcards, the rumors, the shadows they were ghosts Ness could never exorcise. For Cleveland, the murders became legend. Parents told their children stories of the butcher as a warning never to wander too far. Writers and historians returned to the case time and again, seeking answers that remained elusive. The butcher became less a man than a symbol, a reminder of the darkness that can live undetected among us. In the end, the greatest horror of the Cleveland torso murders is not the gruesome details of the crimes themselves, but the silence that followed. Silence from the phantom, silence from the evidence, silence from history itself. The Butcher of Kingsbury Run remains a question mark carved into Cleveland's pasta riddle with no solution, a shadow with no name. And perhaps that is why the story still grips us today. Because the Phantom of Kingsbury Run is more than just a killer lost to time. He is every unanswered question, every fear that justice might fail, and every reminder that sometimes the monsters we fear most are the ones we never truly see.